Milosevic-esque foreign policy. Whereas Milosevic's policy was a first resort. In the case of Putin, it seems to be a last resort. It's taken him only 25 years to finally pursue a policy of the repatriation of quote-unquote Russian-speaking territories in Ukraine as part of Russia proper. And of course, the logic is that the more hostile and opposed Europe becomes to Russia, the more aggressive Russia becomes, which in turn makes the possibility of peace in Ukraine impossible, because it will basically require that Zelensky cannot survive while Putin does. One can't live while the other survives, thereby guaranteeing constant warfare and the futility of peace in Ukraine. And once you have that, you have basically achieved what British theorists have wanted to achieve in World War One by getting the Tsar and the Kaiser to fight, or what Roosevelt and what Winston Churchill wanted in World War Two, which was getting Hitler and Stalin to fight. You're basically taking the European powers and you're pitting them against the heartland and ensuring that basically they're directed against each other and not directed against the forces from without. And that's why I believe Mackinder, at least from, you can say, in vagaries, in sort of grand strategic thinking, you can take someone like Mackinder and see the continuities and the implications of this mode of thinking being employed again and again and again and again over the course of the last 120 years.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in the sort of because I do think there is a form of asymmetric warfare going on in an information war, which is why I think we have to be careful and question what it is we're listening to on YouTube and social media, and what sort of becomes received wisdom in somebody like Tucker Carlson, for example. And you think, are they really as innocent as what he paints out? And ultimately, I think it leaves you in a strange position, because the position that you're expected to adopt is one of complete sort of impotence and neutrality. And I'm always suspicious when that's pitched to me in any context. And I just find it very interesting times.
Well, it's very interesting you bring up that phrase, impotent neutrality, because of course I believe neutrality is not impotent, but when you add that prefix, it actually sums up so much of Russian political thinking and indeed Stalin's political thinking. During the aftermath of World War II, Stalin wanted Germany to be impotently neutral. Basically, we're talking about the Morgenthau plan on steroids, complete deindustrialization, depopulation, and being treated essentially as a European no man's land. You can almost say that what Russia is achieving de facto is a Morgenthau plan, which is basically being able to inflict by the disastrous policy of its enemies, you can say, i.e. the deindustrialization of, and by extension, the impotence of Europe. But that is a continual threat. I mean, it's even the case with Austria today. What Austrian reunification in the 1950s and 1955 was predicated on was this idea that Austria will be neutral and Austria shall never be allowed to join NATO. And while Finland and Sweden have gone away from that, Austria has remained so in that case. That again is a legacy of this Soviet/Russian idea of their interpretation, their version of neutrality, so to speak. And again, you can say that as one version of the heartland theory. Does the heartland theory essentially want to establish alliance, want to thwart alliances between these two states? Or would it be essentially content to have one be politically neutered or the other? I think the heartland theory actually doesn't allow for that. It doesn't really make any contentions for peace. And something which I also believe has in some cases invalidated Mackinder is that Mackinder is a realist. Mackinder doesn't pay heed to the notions of international law, or really you can say the efficacy of things like permanent systems of peace, even though he was writing at a time at the nascence of the League of Nations, which of course we all know was a disaster in hindsight. But what is assumed in Mackinder is a system in constant conflict. And you can see that being played out in Ukraine. But what Putin seems to be going for, ironically, is a system of international law. He wants to appeal to the rights of countries like Iran. You can say, oh, look, the attack on Iran recently on Fordow, etc., it was a violation of international law. And so China and Russia must uphold the rights of the smaller states and international law, nuclear non-proliferation, etc., etc. While the Mackinder thesis basically enforces this idea, like traditional realists, realpolitikers, of the Hobbesian state of nature. There is constant conflict, and it's simply a matter of ensuring that the heartland does not establish a hegemony over the world island in order to threaten the British Isles effectively. That by a roundabout way of, again, trying to answer some of your questions.
Yes, and I mean, I've noticed this sort of obsession of not just Russia, but also China and various countries around there with the United Nations, but to almost autistically sort of deferring to the authority and the legitimacy of the United Nations. And what I think that does is to say that, yes, ultimately, we will take ownership of law and authority. We will become actually the Leviathan, and it's the Western nations, it's the Atlanticists, it's the collective Wests and Israel who are the barbarians, who are outside of international law. The international norm becomes the sort of what the heartland wants is the long play being ruled out here. And I actually think the West fall into that quite a bit. Even the sort of the total disregard that Netanyahu has, where you have then the global South looking at what's happening in Gaza and being kind of tacitly sort of nodded along and encouraged by countries like Russia or China to say, yes, this is just totally beyond the bounds. We can't allow this to happen. This is wrong. And so what you see is that the heartland then, in the case of this discussion, all kind of elbows aside the original sort of liberal, classic liberal ideals which created it, which were of the West, and instead puts their own sort of they sort of subsume it, they take it over, and they say, yeah, we are actually international law, and it is the West that is crazy. And you also see that the Duginism of everybody, all these different little ethnic enclaves and all these different tribes and all these different, yes, you will all be protected and we're going to make sure you're all protected. It's the liberal West, which is insane, which is imperialistic, which doesn't care about international law. We are the foundation. We are the solid granite rock of international relations. And it is Washington, London, and the European Union who are these maniacs outside of normality and the bounds of normal, which is, of course, completely inverts the sort of end of history. We will all become liberals around the world sooner or later. It pushes them on the outside. It pushes that, like, quite literally, institutionally, it pushes them out onto the rimland. It pushes them back out into the periphery of the sea lanes and away from the heart, the literal heartland.
And just to buttress your point, I think the reason for this is not just an inversion of liberal values, but I think, again, this comes back to the question of geography, which is ultimately what Mackinder specializes in. The idea that Russia can afford essentially to take more blows. It can afford to take a more legalistic interpretation of things because it has strategic depth, it has manpower, and it has resources in a way that the Western countries, with the exception ultimately of America, but not to the same extent as Russia, do not have. And this is basically played out in the idea in both both wars, that Germany attacks Russia first. In both cases, Germany seems to be operating from the assumption that we need to assert tactical superiority in the short term against Russia, because in the long term, the more we basically allow for Russia to consolidate its position, we will be in a weaker position vis-a-vis Russia because of these inbuilt advantages which, in Mackinder-esque fashion, the heartland affords, and thereby it compels us towards necessity knows no laws, and we must effectively engage in desperate actions, whether it be, for example, the thinking of Moltke and the Two-Front War, or indeed the thinking of Hitler, just knock in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down effectively. So yeah, in the same way, you can say that Western thinkers were looking at using tactical nukes to offset the manpower disadvantages that the NATO armies had versus the Red Army. It's built around this association that Russia and China now can afford to play for time in a way that the West can't, and thereby the West will be forced into making or asserting positions which seem contrary to things like international law, and thereby, ironically, heartland, the Russia, becomes the guarantee of such systems of international law.
Yes, you see as well with Iran, who became like the Ayatollah became a meme because nothing ever happens. He just does literally nothing. They just get abuse after abuse after abuse, and yeah, they will do a kind of performative retaliation, which strikes an airfield here or there. But actually not much. And then when you get the quote unquote 12 days war, what I found interesting was that after Israel struck Iran, they tweeted out, just remember, we did not initiate this. And then they actually hit back pretty hard, to the point that my view on that is that Israel went running to America begging them to sort some sort of ceasefire out. And so you see again this idea that, well, we are not the ones breaking international law. In fact, we're going to bend over backwards not to be perceived as being the aggressors, and we are going to do everything that we can. And you get into this kind of sort of bureaucratic horse trading where they're not the International Atomic Agency. Now they can legitimately say, well, we were taken for a ride. We were ripped off. We did everything that you wanted. We were in negotiations. And you see, actually, it does actually flesh out their case. It does actually work in a kind of long drawn out way. And again, it's the West who are transgressing these laws which they set up themselves.
Yes, and you're exactly right to use the example of Israel vis-a-vis Iran as a comparison. We talk about Semigog's idea about the necessity of using the Middle East as a means basically to destabilize the whole notion of the world island. And then we take about the idea of forcing Germany to fight off against the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire. The logic is always the same. And speaking of Semigog, you've been very patient. Anything you would like to say?
One thing to the earlier point about Germany and Russia fighting, and this notion that that somehow Russia is this placid, peaceful creature, and it doesn't have expansionist desires. That is, of course, preposterous. Basically, for the simple reason that it's threatened by a too powerful Germany on its western flank, and so that has to be resolved. Now, a lot of that has been shifted over to the dynamic of Russia and China as two massive and powerful states in Eurasia, but historically there was every reason for Russia to undertake aggressive efforts in order to basically to subsume Germany in one fashion or another, or impose a kind of atrophy upon it. And in part, that's because of the way in which Germany has been used by the West, or goaded or provoked by the West. But it's not as though they don't have their own agency, or did not historically. And then there's the other idea of how one conceives of war. The more I read about history and politics and strategy, the more I am very much of the opinion that there everything is a state of war. It's not a